Ahoy! It's been 9 entire weeks of doing this series, and now we get to one of my favorites in terms of the chapters. It's like a bad movie. It's so bad, it's good. We're going to talk about intelligence. So, what does that really mean? It means we're going to talk about what the heck is intelligence to begin with. How do you even operationalize that? Because it turns out that basically everyone has a different idea of what intelligence is, and that includes researchers. And so, for about 150 odd years, researchers have been trying to narrow down and actually develop tests and measures of what intelligence is. And yep, Cadenza's already bringing up in chat. We're going to talk about Mensa. Don't worry about that. We will talk. We will get into it. And oh boy, will we get into it. We're going to talk about intelligence testing and the history of developing measures. We're going to talk about genetics and environmental factors. We're going to talk about population level data. We're going to talk about individual level data. We're going to actually call back to a lot of what we talked about in even like the first and second week about what makes a good measure. Because let me tell you, there fucking are none for intelligence. Spoilers for the last slide. All right, and then we're going to talk about group differences in IQ. You've probably heard about the bell curve, that really cool book that's basically just a thin proxy for racism. We're going to talk about it and a little bit of why it sucks. But instead of just being like, it sucks because it's dumb, I'm going to give some very good and scientific reasons why it's dumb and sucks. So let's get into it. All right. First question. I always like to define terms. It's easier to talk about things after you've gone ahead and kind of set aside the thing. And that's very hard with intelligence because once you really get into it, you're like, okay, well, what is intelligence? Everyone's got an idea. And that's the problem, is that no one has a singular definition. So way back when, a psychologist with the name of Boring came up with probably the most, I think, one of the more useful or more accurate, but not very useful definitions of intelligence. And what is intelligence? Intelligence is whatever you're testing. If you say that this is an intelligence test and it's basically about scientific reasoning. You give people a hypothesis and ask them to design a study. That's intelligence because intelligence is whatever you want it to be by just developing the test. It doesn't really have a singular definition. It's fluid. It's like water. It just kind of becomes the cup that you put it into. But if we're trying to be scientific about it, that's not a very good definition to go on. After all, how do you develop a test if the result is also the question? It's it's a little bit different. Thank you, Rep. I forgot to turn my alert box off, so you're gonna have to deal with this if you're watching on YouTube. All right, so early definitions of intelligence dealt with the idea of intelligence as sensory capacity. Now, remember, way back when we talked about sort of sensory information and perception, we're being bombarded with information all the time. There is more raw data coming in at us than we can ever possibly process. And so Galton, way back in 1884, decided that, well, obviously that's intelligence, right? It's our ability to process information. It's not particularly tied to an academic subject or a particular skill, but it's how much data can we take in? How much can we really do there? So like right now, you're watching me on Twitch, maybe you're watching the archive on YouTube, whatever, you're sitting in a chair. You've got sensory information coming up through your buttocks as you're sitting there all squatted there. Maybe it's a cold room. Hey, it's December. Maybe you don't have the heat on. Maybe it's cold. So every inch of your skin is sending you information right now. And on top of that, you've got everything you're seeing, everything you're hearing. You've got all this stuff going on. And you can't possibly attend to all of it because I am such a captivating and rapturous beauty. So you're just firmly fixed on everything that I'm doing and saying, obviously, right? Well, Galton would say that your ability to take in more information would then say that that's a sign of intelligence, which as you go on, as you get into people, especially is problematic for a number of reasons. As just came up in chat, I mean, we think about people that may be on the autism spectrum that are experience sensory overload, or people might necessarily have better eyesight, but maybe might be deaf. How do you deal with that? Well, you don't. This is why this theory doesn't really work. Even then, even our different senses are only weakly correlated. For example, I have pretty good eyesight, but I've blown my ears out at punk concerts when I was a kid. So my hearing is not that good. And if I ever have to ask you to repeat yourself at some point, it's because I'm kind of hard of hearing. Which again, if we want to think about intelligence as like a fixed thing, a person is intelligent, well then how do you deal with somebody who damages their ears listening to Vocaloid covers on their headphones? You can't. This definition doesn't really hold up. And even when you do look at stuff, what we call modern IQ tests, it doesn't really correlate very well. So remember, way back when we talked about research methods, we talked about divergent and convergent validity. Convergent validity is going to come back a lot, so let's refresh on that one. Convergent validity means that if you are looking at a good measure, a valid measure of something, it should generally hang together or correlate with other measures of the same thing. So if I want to measure height, for example, let's say I'm a weird American, I measure things in feet versus the rest of the world that measures things in meters. Well, they work because they're convergently valid. As you go up in feet, you also go up in meters. So we would say, yeah, that's a valid measure. And obviously, why are you using that as an example? Well, because it is so on face valid. And it's like, but if you do look at something like sensory capacity as a measure of intelligence, it doesn't really hold up with the other things that are supposed to be measuring intelligence. So either all the other tests are wrong, they probably are, or this one is wrong. It's also probably true. Turns out two things can be wrong at the same time. All right. So yeah, let's move on. Well, what about abstract thinking? I mean, when I said intelligence, this probably came into your definition. In fact, most people include it in their definitions. And in the first intelligence tests, Binet and Simon in 1905, a little short hop, skip, and a jump when we were talking about sensory capacity, they decided they wanted to develop a test. And so they developed the Binet and Simon into like standardized intelligence test with the objective to identify low learners. And there's going to be a couple things here I'm going to say, please put a pin in that. I want you to really remember that. When we think about the origin of standardized intelligence tests, it was not designed to identify geniuses. It was designed to identify slow learners among groups of children. So, there's a focus on reasoning and understanding in their definition. Basically, they put together a test of different measures and all that, looking at similarities between items. So, for example, you might say here's a bunch of different fruits or anything like that. And to define, let's say, apple, orange, banana, etc., and there's a potato in there, and say which one of these doesn't matter. They might give you sentences to complete. They might give you different objects and say, name this. You're also going to notice that a lot of these are language tasks. They're things that people would generally consider to be part of the oral section of something like the GRE or the ACT or the SAT, because they're bounded by language and whether or not a person can name certain things. Now, as diverse as those questions are, they tend to be generally correlated. So it's a step up from sensory capacity, but we'll get into more issues later. So abstract thinking, though, is generally going to go as be a good through line here. And it's included in most modern definitions of intelligence. So if a researcher is sitting down and they say, well, what is intelligence? I want to come up with a new measure or a new theory. In general, abstract thinking is going to fall into there. And that can mean a lot of things because it turns out it's actually a very abstract definition to begin with. You could say creativity. Remember last week we talked about sort of out of the box thinking and insight? If you give someone, again, the same problem, a box, it's full of tacks, and then you give them a candle and you say, I want you to mount this candle to the wall. Well, the one solution, but requires some creativity, is to use the tacks to attach the box to the wall. And that is gonna allow you to then rest the candle on it and complete the problem. But some people have a hard time dealing with that because They might not consider the box part of the materials they've been given. And so when we're thinking about abstract thinking, creativity shows up very often in these definitions. So does stuff like mathematical ability, or what we consider more nonverbal skills, stuff like art, for example, might come up as well. And it's like hand-eye coordination might come up. So there's all kinds of different things that fall under this umbrella, which makes it very hard to come up with a singular definition that is also gonna apply more generally. So this is where Spearman comes in and tries to innovate and says, hey, that intelligence test is cool. You got some good ideas here. But I think there's something we need to talk about, because even if these items are correlated, there's got to be something else there. And so we get the introduction of G, or general intelligence, and S, or specific ability. So in Spearman's definition, we get a little bit more diversification. And there's the idea that there is general intelligence, which is like the ability for you to do well on similar tasks. Remember, they're asking you to do these language tasks, they're asking you to do sorting tasks, they're asking you to do all this stuff. Basically, what Spearman would say is the commonality between that, or the correlation between those items, is your general intelligence. But maybe you do better or worse on some. Maybe you're really good at art, but you're not necessarily creative. Like you're good at sketching real scenes, but you have a hard time coming up with new poses on your own. Or maybe you're really good at math, but you maybe lag a little bit behind in logic somehow. Or you're very quick at math, but at a very basic level. You have a harder time with more complicated problems, but you're good at quick math or speed math. These are different subsets, different specific abilities. And so you've got general intelligence. And then you've got this, or yeah, it's a good observation from Brent in chat of like, if you have somebody where maybe you're very good at, like, you have your multiplication tables just down pat. You always had that on deck. But then you're not very good at long division. You struggle to do that in your head. So this is a way of trying to break things out and say, you've got a general intelligence out there, and then you've got a more specific subsets of skills. Yeah. And it comes up also in modern brain trainers as well. So you'll see stuff like that where you have different compartments. You'll have saying like, this is your overall score, this is where you are in math, this is where you are in memorization and all that. That is owed to, in large part, Spearman, for trying to break out this idea of a specific skill set and how that contributes to a broader whole of your intelligence. So here's where you get questions like this. Stuff like you might get multiplication tables. You might be asked to rotate a shape in your mind. Here's a shape. It matches up with one of the other things, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's asking you to do mental rotation. A hard skill for some people, but they might be very good at multiplication, or they might be very good at language tasks, but not necessarily good at the other two. So this is a way of, again, trying to break this stuff out. Let's see, pretty sure it's 3. Let's go back. Is it 3? Yeah, it's 3. Congratulations, you got it right. All right, so how do we think about this? Again, so let's keep going on, because the history of this is basically trying to increasingly specify intelligence. We start very general, and we try to move with various direction toward more specific answers to what is intelligence. So we get this idea later on of a breakout between fluid and crystallized intelligence. It's intuitive, it makes sense if you visualize it like this way, where you've got fluid is our ability to learn. So we're able to, it's malleable, it moves around, it's different, it's our ability to comprehend and process new information. And then as we learn new information, it becomes crystallized. It's kind of analogous to working versus long-term memory. So over time, we might have a lot of fluid intelligence when we're younger, and then as we learn things, this theory would posit that our brains kind of harden, we accumulate knowledge, we accumulate facts about the world, there's a limit to what we can retain and all that, and if you remember the memory chapter, yeah, this is not going to hold up. There is a little bit of evidence for this, and that younger people tend to be better at learning. I mean, remember we talked about language, that there's a specific window where young people tend to be extremely good at learning certain skills, language especially. Young kids before puberty are way better at learning languages than people that have ended up a little bit harder, like a little bit older, like let's say me. It's very hard trying to pick up a second language as an adult, but it's way easier to do that as a kid. Also, adults tend to know more stuff, right? Right? Like that's what we think about, right? They tend to have more crystallized intelligence insofar as we think about crystallized intelligence as just having information. And it looks like I have broken. Let's see. There we go. Let's see if I can open my eye again. Oops, looks like I'm broken. Worse things have happened in my life. Better things too, though. All right, well, while I try to figure this out, let's keep going. Yeah, it could be worse. At least I'm smiling. Anyway, all right. So, like I said, we are generally talking about intelligence as a... Whoa, came back. There we go. We're talking about intelligence as a story of going from being very general to being hyper specific. And this is where we start to break a little bit. We get into Gardner's multiple intelligences theory as an attempt to really pull away from a more rigid idea of what is or is not intelligent. So Gardner wants to operationalize this and say, look, we have G and we have S. That's cool. So we have general intelligence and specific skills. Gardner, in their argument for multiple intelligences as a theory, says we're going to throw that out. G doesn't exist. There is no such thing as general intelligence. There is only the specific skills. And so you have, there's stuff like musical ability, facial ability, what Gardner called naturalistic, which is basically like, are you good at camping? Interpersonal, intrapersonal. Are you aware of yourself? Do you have a lot of self-directed insight? Are you good at talking to other people? Obviously, spatial tasks. A lot of these skills have come up in the past, but the main difference with Gardner's perspective is there is no general intelligence. There's all these little intelligences floating around that are distinct. They do not connect with each other in the same way that someone like Spearman would try to consider. And there are a lot of issues with this. It's a cool idea. It's nice. It's intuitive. Because I mean, come on, let's think about this. Let's go back. I think we all know somebody or have been somebody who might be very good at music, but not necessarily good at being out in nature. We have people that are good at languages, but aren't good at math. And Gardner would try to tell you that because that's fine. That can perfectly exist because you have all these different skills, and being good at one doesn't necessarily mean you should be expected to be good at the other. I mean, for example, I'm pretty good at research scholarship, but I'm not a very good streamer. So Gardner would say, well, you're very high in academic intelligence, but not good in content intelligence. But again, there's issues here. It is intuitive to think about things as having individual strengths and weaknesses. But what makes something an intelligence, right? Like, that's the hard part. I mean, let's keep coming back to this, right? But naturalistic, it's your ability to recognize, identify, and understand animals, plants, and other living things. Is that really a separate intelligence? What about humor? Again, humor. Like, does that fall under interpersonal skills? Is that empathy? Is empathy an intelligence? What about memory? You know, we've talked about math there, spatial is there, but like, what about people who have just eidetic memories that can recall obscure information years later? That's an intelligence, right? But it's hard to draw these lines because part of the multiple intelligences model is that these are distinct. They don't necessarily have to overlap. So how small of a piece can you cut? And so it's an intuitive idea, but when you try to actually really put it together, it's basically impossible to falsify because not only do you have to make those distinctions to say when does something become a unique intelligence, but how do you justify that? How do you falsify that? You can't. It's one of the biggest problems with a lot of intelligence and a lot of the research around this. Think back to that first quote. Intelligence is what the test tests. It's hard. It's very hard to try to pull together a falsifiable theory of intelligence. And no one so far has really put together a great model. There's cool ideas, there's different things floating around, but they all tend to have some kind of problem with them. So even here, Gardner is like, no, you've got all these different spheres, they're different they're different intelligences, but when you measure them, they're not truly independent, even though Gardner wants to say that they are. So Sternberg reacts to this again and says, no, we need to pull this back together. And so what Sternberg does is trying to kind of marry the idea of multiple intelligences with the model of G. Remember, general intelligence is G, trying to pull that back together in what's called the triarchic model. So that's the one to say that, okay, so you've got practical knowledge, your street smarts, as it were. You've got creative skills, and you've got analytical skills or book smarts. So instead of having all these multiple intelligences, there's three. So basically you've got academic skill, social skill, and creative skill. And having one doesn't necessarily mean you have the other. So it's trying to pull together a little bit of all of that, right? So we've got diversification coming from Gardner's multiple intelligences. We've got a general idea about where something would fit, like about a generalized intelligence, like pulling in a little bit more of that relational factor. So instead of Gardner being like, they're all separate, it's like, no, there's overlap and they kind of come together and they kind of diversify and like you can be good at some and not good at others and so on and so on and so on. It's, again, it's an attempt to try to rectify a very obvious problem with how we talk about and measure intelligence, which is no one really knows how to do it. Everyone has intuitive theories about it. And trying to operationalize those or find ways to measure them or develop a measurable theory of intelligence is incredibly difficult. So yeah, again, a lot of the weaknesses for the triarchic theory are pretty clear cut. It's hard to falsify. It's the same problem that happens again. It's intelligence is what the test tests. And so if you just say, all right, well, we designed a test, you have three different subscales. One looks at academic skills, one looks at social skills, one looks at this, and then you get scores on those and you say, well, obviously it worked. That's what intelligence is because you designed the test with this theory in mind. So of course it's producing results that fall in line with your theory. Unfortunately, though, again, like part of the idea here is that they are largely distinct. There is not a huge amount of overlap. They can overlap, but it doesn't exist. But again, it doesn't really hold up, even in these theories. When you do measure them, the triarchic theory should say, at the end of the day, you've got three different groups, three different boxes for intelligence that are largely distinct. Unfortunately, that doesn't hold up in the tests that they make. Oh, it's frustrating. Oh boy. Let's get into some fun stuff. I'm gonna take a sippy here if anyone has any questions. Oh, that's good water. All right, there's gonna be office hours afterwards as well too. So if you have any other questions, just hold them till then. All right, the biological basis of intelligence. So it turns out that brain volume is positively correlated with intelligence. Now, here's the deal though, and this is important. When I talk about R values in this, remember R values are a measure of correlation. Specifically, I want to give you guys a crash course here, or a refresher if you've been watching along. What exactly is an R value? An R value is a measure of relationship. If you want to interpret it, basically we would say on shorthand, 1 to 2, or 0.1 to 0.2, these scale from 0 to 1. 0.1 to 0.2 is where we would say that these things are basically unrelated, and any relationship that you're observing between them is basically noise. 3 to 4 is where we would say that it is a weak correlation. That there is something going on there, but there's a lot of other information. Yeah, barely correlated is a good way to put it. 5 to 6, even up into 7, is like 5 to 6, again, moderately correlated. 7 to 8, we would say highly correlated. 9 and above, or even upper 80s, so like a 0.8, a 0.8, a 0.86, something like that. That's when you're threading the line where we might say that you are basically measuring the same thing. So in this case, yeah, having a bigger brain is correlated with intelligence, but not really. It's a weak correlation, and we know from the way that neurons work that people tend to have, as they develop more information, or they acquire more information, and they develop new skills, their neurons are going to grow new connections, and so you've got all kinds of other things to go on. So you cannot, unfortunately, just measure a person's brain volume and say, this is how smart you are. For those of you that have bought your calipers, I hope you brought the receipt. This is not a phrenology lecture yet. I got bad news for you on that front anyway. But yeah, if you put more brain in your skull, you will not become smarter. Unfortunately, yeah, it turns out phrenologists were wrong about that one too, among everything else too. Can't wait to dig into those boys. So what about brain activity? Well, if you put somebody into a MRI and you have them play Tetris, people that tend to score more highly on intelligence tests tend to get better over time. And the more they learn, they tend to actually show less brain activity overall. This is interesting because you would think, like, well, obviously, intelligence must be brain activity if it's not brain volume, right? That would seem intuitive at first. You would think, all right, well, if you put me in an MRI and my brain lights up like a Christmas tree, that must mean that I got a lot of activity going on there. Not necessarily, because it might not necessarily be efficient activity. People have a lot more activity early on into the learning process than they do when they are more proficient at a task. Think about this. Again, this is kind of intuitive when you stop to think about it. So when you are doing, let's say you're making breakfast. We've talked about how a lot of the stuff that we do every day eventually becomes automatic for us, and this speaks to it. There's not as much going on when I'm going and I'm making my breakfast because I tend to make the same thing, or like one of 3 different things every day. So I don't have to think about it as much. But that doesn't mean that I'm less skilled. And the same thing is true of something like an exam, for example. If you really studied hard, you can just breeze through it. You don't have to think too hard about any of the individual questions. You just kind of have the information in your brain. Yeah. Or if you're playing a video game, let's say you're playing a fighting game, you don't have to think about all of your options. You're just like, well, my opponent is jumping at me, so I will simply anti-air them. It becomes a much more streamlined process, and so having a lot of activity going on in your brain doesn't necessarily mean that you're more intelligent. Also, fun story, this study about intelligence and brain activity had an N of 8. That means that there were only 8 people in the study. And let's just say that is, we call that underpowered. When you have too few people to really be making those same kind of, any kind of strong statistical conclusion. So intuitively, yeah, we talked about efficiency, we talked about all that going on, but this is and as an aside, this is a serious problem with a large number of neuroscience studies. It's actually an extraordinary problem, and potentially a field jeopardizing problem. A lot of the fundamental work that's been done in neuroscience with MRIs and all that is also very expensive to do, meaning it's very hard to find participants and pay them, which means that a lot of these very seminal studies that people have been building on have like 5 people in the sample, and yet they're trying to make conclusions about the entirety of the human race. Cool, right? Great. Love it. All right. So moving on a little bit. Well, what about, oh, this is going to be fun. What about reaction time? We talked about sensory information, right? Well, if a person has a faster reaction time, that must mean that they're processing information faster. And that must then mean that they are more intelligent. Well, let me jeopardize that theory pretty directly here. Give me 1 second here. I'm gonna go boop on over to the here we go. Whoop, that's the wrong. Whoop, here we go. All right, here we go. So this is the red light, green light reaction time test. Unfortunately, I wanted to do milia blocker, and it turns out it doesn't exist anymore. So this is what we got. And I'm going to be doing this old Washington University Java-based reaction time test. Unfortunately, it's not the test from the popular, the popular Netflix sensation Squid Game, which has now become a real life thing thanks to Mr. Beast, and it's terrible. I hate it. Imagine just like taking all significance and meaning from something in the worst possible way. Anyway, let's play red light, green light. So the idea here is that if you are faster again, then you should be able to process information quickly, and that means that you're more intelligent. So let's see what I can get here. Two point three milli. Like, all right. 2.9. 0.48. And I'm gonna get this one. I'm gonna crush it. Well, that means I'm super intelligent, right? It's always a fun demo to show off. Yeah, I at one point back in the age where Flash still operated and like everything worked like that, I did use milia blocker in my class. And then when one of my students asked me if I knew what Guilty Gear was, I said no and walked away. Can't let my students know what I can't let my real life students know what I do in my free time. Yeah, if you take away that first 21-second trial, I'm probably doing fine, right? But anyway, so not a great measure, and it's kind of the same problem with stuff like working memory. You know, people would say that, well, if you have more working memory capacity, well, that's intelligence, right? It would lead to easier problem solving. Or some people have already put together that, or have also said that, well, you know, obviously intelligence is stored in the prefrontal cortex. You know, when we do these studies on neural activity and we're doing our neuroscience work, we see that, gee, remember general intelligence loaded tasks like spatial rotation and math and stuff like that are really, they trigger a lot of prefrontal cortex activity. So it's, again, this is kind of a hodgepodge of different information, because some people will tell you that, well, intelligence is correlated with reaction time. Some people will say it's about working memory, and some people will say, well, when you put you in an fMRI, we can see that certain parts of your brain light up, and that must mean that there's more or less intelligence there. But again, this is the core struggle, is trying to operationalize intelligence, a thing that everyone seems to have a stake in, and everyone has a different idea about, but no one can seem to ever decide on what a singular definition of it should be. So, oddly enough, if you just ask people If you just threw your hands up and said, I'm done with this test, I'm done with all these tests, I'm done with the reaction times, I'm done with all that, and you ask people to just self-report, do you think you are smart? There is a correlation there. So they pull people into the lab, they give them a battery of intelligence tests, and they ask them, how well do you think you did? Now, it's not a great correlation because people tend to want to over-report, people want to look good, people tend to lack some introspective access, but even accounting for all of that, if you just ask people, do you think you're smart? They have an idea. People have an idea of what intelligence is, and it's generally correlated at some level with their own perceptions of themselves. So how do you calculate IQ? Everyone's probably heard this before, right? You've heard about IQ scores. They range from usually like, what is it? I think from like 50 to 200. It's somewhere where people tend to self-report. So how are these actually calculated? Well, Stanford Binet developed, again, an IQ test. And what they were really looking for is to create norms for comparisons and to compute someone's mental age. And the way they did this is by taking someone's mental age, aka they would give this person a series of tasks. And then they would say, well, you were reading you're in 3rd grade, but you were reading at a 5th grade level. That person would then have a IQ over 100, because if your mental age and your chronological age are mapping up perfectly, then you have an IQ of 100. If your mental age or skill development is less than your chronological age, you'd have an IQ less than 100. Yep, so that's the thing. This is very heavily tied to age. And we're going to get into one of the major issues with this. And it's, if you're good at math and you've got that high mathematic intelligence, you're already probably seeing that this is going to get harder and harder to keep up with as people get older. Because it turns out that the Stanford Binet IQ test, the one that people use and the one that people go around and talk about as sort of, well, my IQ is 150 and I'm in Mensa. It works very well for children. But as you get older, it kind of falls apart. And that's by design. This test, remember, again, what was the original IQ test designed for? It was meant to identify slow learners among populations of children. So for a 30-year-old to take this, it's like for you to be a 30-year-old and to have a IQ of 150 means you have to be reading at a 45-year-old level. Yes, that's absurd. It doesn't mean anything. But if we're talking about a 6-year-old that is reading at the level of a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old, that is a little bit easier to swallow. Basically, what I'm trying to say is organizations like Mensa that use stuff like IQ as a measure in populations of adults are building a house of cards, because this is not a good metric when you apply it to adults. In fact, well, I guess one way that people do, we'll get to the next slide. One way people deal with this is deviation IQ, where they try to compare to what is normal for an age group, but then you get into issues like, well, where do you define an age group? Do you say that the 40-year-old is that much different than the 30-year-old? Is the 25-year-old that much different than the 31-year-old? It gets very messy, and it's, even if it is sort of a solution, using deviation IQ and trying to look at norms for an age group is putting a band-aid on a more sincere problem, which is that these tests were not designed for adults. They were designed with children in mind. And this is where we get into the dark part of this lecture, because attempts to extrapolate IQ and IQ testing into adults has had a real body count. Very rarely do psychologists hurt people when they fuck up. It's one of the nice things about being in this field. If I screw up a study, people tend to not die. That is not true in the history of intelligence. IQ testing has historically been used to identify good genes and has been a leading pillar of fascistic eugenics movements in the idea of using intelligence tests to identify, good genes to pass on to the future generations of a nation. There is this idea that exists around this idea of eugenics and intelligence, that there is a genetic relationship between G, remember, we're going to bring back G, general intelligence, and parentage, that it is heritable, meaning that if you want to have smart kids, you need to have smart adults. So if you are, let's say, for example, a fascist interested in trying to have an intelligent population in your country, well, you want to encourage people with high IQs to reproduce, but when people with low IQs reproduce, that's a problem. Because maybe people that have low IQs are going to have low IQ children. So how do you solve that? Well, one way is to restrict immigration from quote unquote low IQ countries. And another way is to force sterilize. I can't even say it, it's so upsetting. To forcefully sterilize people that are determined to have low IQ. And remember, let's go back to that opening quote: intelligence is what the test measures, which means you can design a measure of intelligence, tell you what you want, and you can use that to hurt people. And people have done this, and it is very hard, I think irresponsible even, to talk about IQ testing and intelligence without talking about this as well. Shit, you can look in American documentation around immigration, and what you will find is that there were hierarchies and lists of different countries that were seen to be as low IQ, and then immigration authorities restricted people from those countries from entering the US. But then you even have the racialized intelligence stereotypes that were used to justify trying to give people incentives. So, for example, I've come across documents that say, like, well, the Germans are very industrious and we want to incentivize them to come here. And so we might have a higher immigration quota for Germans. But, those Eastern Europeans, though, nah. And surprise, surprise, yeah, it goes along with white versus non-white most of the time. And as you might recall, there was periods of time when the Irish and Italians were not considered white. And you see that reflected with a lot of these racial epithets talking about how the Irish are a low IQ people, or how Italians are low IQ and undesirable for potential immigrants to America. In the wild world of forced sterilization between 1905 to 1979, it was almost into the 80s that laws had a requirement to sterilize quote unquote low IQ individuals. Leading up into 1979, this is not a thing that happened like way back when and we got better. This was happening into the late 70s. There were laws on the books to sterilize certain people. I mean, look at this. I mean, back like over 3,000 people during those years, from 1905 to 1979, were forcefully sterilized in California. Another set in Georgia, in Virginia, in North Carolina. Those 4 states together, my math intelligence is great, over 12,000 people were forcefully sterilized because of intelligence tests. Sit with that for a second. Like, I've just sit here and told you how they're bad measures. None of them are good, even up until the early 1900s or the early 20th century. People still didn't have a solid definition, which means these forced sterilization protocols were happening almost right away. This process even started before, like, right around the time that IQ testing became a thing. It is impossible to talk about the history of IQ tests and not talk about this, because their development goes hand in hand. So how do we talk about IQ today? It's a little bit different. So things have been changed around a little bit. One of the issues we talked about, the problem with trying to understand adult intelligence, has been a little bit rectified with stuff like the WAIS, or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is 15 subtests that give 5 scores in 5 different groups: overall intelligence, remember G, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. But these are the broader points. And so what does this actually look like? Well, let me let me blow that up for you. I think it's this one. Time to roll the dice, I guess. Let's see, I've got this stored somewhere, and give me 1 second. I'm just going to bring this up. Here's the ways. Whoop! There we go. So, for example, in something like this, let's say if you're looking for information processing on the ways, remember this is an adult test, you might get something like, what continent is France on? You might get into stuff like comprehension or picture completion, where you're saying that there's a wheel that there's a branch of that windmill, or a fin, or whatever you call them, of that windmill that is missing. You might get vocabulary or digit spans, block design, and looking at pattern recognition and all these different characteristics, but it's still rooted in the same underlying ideology. There is general intelligence, there is specific intelligence, and this time is just trying to take this paradigm of intelligence testing and age it up a bit so it can be applied to adults. But it has a lot of the same problems. A fun aside here, I at one point met a girlfriend because she was a counseling student who needed to give someone the WAIS test as part of her class, and a friend of mine was trying to set us up, so he volunteered me, like, oh yeah, just go test her. And it was my first year in grad school. I didn't really know anybody. Now the fun thing about this is that she was giving me the exam and like give me the paper with the patterns on it and everything. What she didn't know is that I can read upside down, and she had the answer book open in front of her across the table. So let's just say my score was outstanding. It's a very valid test. So moving on a little bit, and more attempts to try to rectify some core issues. Remember that a lot of those things that I talked about were language skills. And even on the WAIS, a lot of them are language development, like are tied to language. So what does that ultimately mean? Well, let's just say that it is very hard when you are learning English as a second language to take an intelligence test in English. Correspondingly, if I were to take an intelligence test in German or in Spanish, and as Raina just pointed out in chat, yeah, when you wed that information to what we now talked about with immigration, think about that for a second. You're identifying these people as being low IQ, yeah, because they don't fucking speak English. Ugh. Like, ugh. It's like, it's so much worse. It's so much worse the more you think about it. So there have been some attempts to pivot to going to more non-verbal skills. Because remember, abstract reasoning is kind of the core of what people tend to think of as intelligence. And so, well, what if we talked about shape and pattern recognition? I want to say with this one, the answer is 6. I think it's 6. Yeah, it's 6. If you're playing along at home. Yeah. So this is an attempt to create culturally fair intelligence tests to get away from language skills, because it turns out that some people might test as being developmentally delayed, especially bilingual kids or kids that are learning English as a second language might test as being developmentally delayed when they're tested in English. But they do fine when they're tested in their native language. This is a serious problem. If you are trying to say, well, this is a measure of intelligence, as a a broad, abstract, quantifiable way of thinking about the world and the way people interact in it, it's incredibly bounded to the English language. And that's a huge problem. Now let's get into college admission tests, because these are a form of intelligence test, and they're designed to predict academic success. So the SAT, the GRE, the SAT is the something, I never took the SAT, I don't remember what it stands for. But the GRE, if you're not familiar with it, is the Graduate Records Exam. Now, these tend to correlate highly with IQ. Remember, like 7 and above, we're getting into the territory of you're measuring the same thing. Because it turns out that the GRE, the ACT, the SAT, a lot of these standardized tests pull from very similar question banks. So unsurprisingly, they correlate very well with IQ, right? But what do those other things correlate with? I wonder. It turns out that a lot of these are testing specific competences. And when we look at stuff like coaching courses, if you have ever gone and taken one of these classes, I took several before going, especially taking the GRE, you get into a whole number of other problems with stuff like practice effects and third-party variables. But do these actually predict performance? Fucking no. Absolutely not. They provide a standardized metric. They provide a number that you can use to compare between people. But does someone's GRE score predict their performance in grad school? It doesn't. It's invalid. It's not even a loose correlation. The GRE, the Graduate Records Exam, which a lot of programs do require for you to apply. Some have stopped, thank God. The GRE is an exam, much like the ACT or SAT, that takes a lot of money to take. It's an expensive exam, and there's a whole industry built up around developing coaching courses and prep material, but it turns out it predicts fuck all. Your GRE score has nothing to do with whether or not you will be a good teacher. Your GRE score has nothing to do with whether or not you are going to publish papers, or whether or not you're going to get a job after grad school. Your ACT and SAT don't predict your GPA. They don't predict your ability to get stuff done. They don't predict your ability to get into honors courses. They predict nothing. And yet people still use them because they need to feel like they have to have something. And all these are very well documented. And there's been, you say, oh, we revised the GRE to adjust for these things. It doesn't matter. And it's like, no matter how many times the ACT, SAT, any of these standardized tests are revised, it doesn't change the core problem, which is that they are rooted in the language and mechanisms of intelligence testing without actually connecting to meaningful outcomes. Look, these things are correlated incredibly highly with IQ. People that do well on IQ tests, they do better on the SAT, ACT, SAT, GRE, any combination of 3 letters. And yet, they don't predict performance substantively. I've met tons of people that were trying to flex their GRE scores on me, because let's be real, I'm not good at standardized testing. I'll be honest. My SAT scores, no, ACT, I never took the SAT. My ACT scores were pretty mid. I was barely at the cutoff for the school that I ultimately went to. My GRE scores, the same. It was enough that I was able to get over that hurdle, but then I tended to outperform people that did tremendously better than me on these things that are supposed to be measures of intelligence. They just ain't real. I'm sorry. Sorry to be the bringer of bad news, but or maybe good news. And one of the problems tends to be pretty straightforward, right? If you just don't ever take the people that are, let's say your cutoff is, we don't take people at the school that have an ACT or under 25. What happens? You have no data from anyone with an ACT of under 25. You just said, well, this is what the cutoff is that we're using. And then tried to justify it by saying that, well, they did fine. People that got 24s and 23s probably would have been fine too, but it's so frustrating. I really worked myself into knots over this because it is so, as a psychologist and particularly as a methodologist. I broadly my degree is in social psychology, but I consider myself to be more of what we call a quantitative psychologist. That is to say that I'm more of a data person. I'm really into like research methods and experiments and stuff like that. This stuff makes me angry because it's basically people using bad data that they know is bad data that just tends to justify itself. Because guess what? The people that tend to go along, like, again, just came up in chat. Thank you, Bon. The people that tend to do well move up in the education system, which then puts them in a position to later on potentially make decisions about these kinds of things. Like, so you're in grade school. Your teachers probably did well on the ACT. So they think the ACT matters. And so they're then making those decisions to keep using the ACT even though it doesn't matter. It's a feedback loop that just drains money from people. And never mind the socioeconomics of it. Because when you really want to get in there, right? You think about it. How much do those prep courses cost? And we know these coaching courses help people learn how to take the test. You get all the practical, the tips and the tricks and the practice exams and everything. You get better at taking the test. You do better overall. And guess what? People that are working have to work. Maybe people that can't, or just their families can't afford to send them to these kinds of courses, are going to do worse and then be blocked off from later opportunities in life for no other reason. They couldn't afford the stupid prep course. Oh. Moving on. So are these scores even reliable? We've talked about validity. In adults, yes. In kids, no. Basically, anytime before 3 years old, any kind of like baby intelligence test that people will try to sell is snake oil. The number of times I've seen this passed around on Pop Psych Twitter and Instagram of like, oh, is your baby a genius? Like, here's a home test kit you can use to identify whether or not your 2-year-old is actually going to be the next Einstein. It's hogwash. It's not real. These tests are not designed to be used with infants. Again, IQ tests were designed to identify people that were behind developmentally in populations of children. And they have been built on and extrapolated into areas that they were never designed to be in. So they don't apply to very young kids. So the answer there is, so the question from the chat here is, but like you said, they were applying for children. Yes, but before 3 years old, basically infants, it's usually between about 6 to 9 or like 6 to 10, 6 to 12. So basically like you're 6 years old, like 5 to 6, to pre-adolescence is the point where it tends to matter. But the problem is they aren't even really predictive of adult IQ. So these are generally useful measures for identifying whether or not someone might be falling behind in school or missing developmental milestones. But they're not particularly good at anything else. I mean, let's look at adult intelligence. Let's look at this again. So what are the metrics that probably matter, right? We know these don't predict academic performance. We know they don't predict whether or not you're going to be a good academic. If you're talking about the GRE, they don't predict your class performance. They don't predict your number of papers. They don't predict anything. What are they actually good at? They are decently okay at predicting grades. They are decently sort of okay at predicting job performance. They're generally okay at health literacy. That's about it. Yeah. And even then, remember when we said about R? It's only moderate. There's a whole bunch of other job performance. There are so many other things that can be used to explain that. IQ and the validity of adult intelligence scores it's just not really there. Now, in general, IQ scores tend to be normally distributed, but you might have also heard about this normal distribution via a term and maybe a book that you've heard of called the bell curve, which tries to posit that there are groups of people, frequently racially stratified groups of people, that are more or less intelligent. There is a particular subset of the evolutionary psychology community that are basically phrenologists and eugenicists by a different way, or have found different ways to call themselves. And they tend to care a lot about IQ. So they might come and they'll say that, there is some, I broke myself again. It just keeps happening. There is some evidence that IQ does run in families. Siblings tend to have similar IQs. So when I took that IQ test when I was a kid, I was about 7 or 8 years old, my score was somewhere in the 140s. And then my brother and sister are around the same point. There tends to be a pretty strong correlation there. Now, put a pin in that because I don't want to say this is genetic. Cousins tend to be less so. In twin studies, there is a stronger correlation, about 0.7 to 0.8 in identical twins and 0.3 to 0.4 in fraternal twins. But a huge factor here is not really about the genetic influences, it's the environmental influences. And adoption studies have been used to look at this, and what they find is that twins that are reared apart tend to be kind of similar than twins that are reared together. So, provided that their environments are pretty similar, their intelligences end up being pretty similar as well. And the same thing is true of siblings. Non-identical siblings tend to have very highly or moderately correlated intelligences, probably because they have similar families, similar resources, similar structure to how things are going. And that is a way of developing, lost my train of thought there. That is one way of looking at this, that it's not about the genetic influence, it's about the environmental influence and the resources that a person has. Information trickles down. So what about environment then? Well, there is something to be said about fixed versus growth mindsets. Now, this kind of like power posing took off and turned into a much bigger deal than it really is. Let's go through. I'm gonna go and get Chrome up here, and there we go. Let's watch a quick video here. And where's my clicker? There's my clicker. All right. Let me know if there's any audio issues here, but there shouldn't be. And I'm going to turn on closed caption. And I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller. Ooh. There we go.
Took 5th graders. We give them puzzles to solve.
So you see these blocks? Can you tell me what color is on that side?
Red, yellow, white, blue.
All right, so what I want you to do is put these blocks together so that the picture on top matches the picture here, all right?
First, we give children a set of easier puzzles to do.
Now here's the next one.
When these 9 and 10-year-olds successfully put together the puzzle, the children are praised for either their intelligence
Wow, you did really well. You must be really smart at these.
or the effort they made.
Wow, you did really well. You must have tried really hard at these.
Then we give them a much harder set of problems, ones that they might, in fact, struggle with.
Here's the next one.
And we see what happens to their confidence. Do they think, oh, this means I'm not good at it after all? Do they stop liking the puzzles? Or do they maintain their confidence and think, well, it just needs more effort or strategies? What happens to their motivation?
Are you ready to go on?
Ta-da! We also ask them, well, which problems do you want to work on some more? Those easier ones or those harder ones? And generally we find that kids who have been praised for their intelligence really want to go back to those easier ones that were their claim to fame.
This is a sign of a fixed mindset, the belief that intelligence is innate and can't be changed.
What we found was that children thought that difficulty meant they weren't smart or they weren't good at the task.
So you seem to have more trouble with this one, and I want to know why you think that was.
Probably because I'm not good at these problems.
A very discouraging conclusion.
Other children show a growth mindset.
The growth mindset is like this. No matter who you are, you can always become a great deal smarter. They feel smart when they're working really hard on something difficult and making progress.
So if I gave you some more problems, would you like more problems like these that are pretty easy so you'll do well, or problems like these that'll be hard but you might learn a lot from them?
These.
More like these?
Students praised for effort generally want those hard ones that they can learn from. What I've learned from my research is that kids, and I think adults too, are exquisitely sensitive to what's going on in a situation, what other people value, what they're being judged on. What is that voice in our head saying? Is it saying fixed mindset things like, oh, you better not make a mistake, you better look smart, people are judging you? Or is it saying growth mindset things? Here's an opportunity, here's a mistake I can learn from. I feel smart when I do something difficult.
You'll get hyped for that kid, though. Right? All right, so one caveat here. I always hate when I have to do caveats, but this one actually is pretty important. So fixed versus growth mindset, effect sizes might be a little bit smaller than have been previously estimated, but there is something true there, as you guys all seem to be picking up on here, right? So generally, if you tell somebody this is a measure of your intelligence as a person, and it's going to be indicative of whether or not you are good or bad, people tend to react to that kind of situation differently. If you tell someone that you are bad at this now, and ergo you are going to be bad at this forever, well, it turns out that they might not do it. Versus if you tell somebody that they are capable of doing better, well, then they might be more inclined to try and do new things. So, yeah. It's pretty chill. Unfortunately, this has been like twisted by the grifters and overextended, and like most things, and it's like been wildly extrapolated by on what it was intended to be. It's great, right? I love this field. Let's see if I can fix myself. No, wait. Yeah, okay, I'm back. Yeah, so things like talent and intelligence, don't put too much stock in them. I hope that's the takeaway here. If you're going to take anything away from this, let it be that I am a person who believes in ya. And I think a lot of this stuff is just nonsense. So does birth order matter when we're talking about environment? There is, I put this in italics because it's very small, but when you talk about the population, that is all of the people on Earth, there are very small effects that later born children might have lower IQ than earlier born children. But that could also be true with the fact that, again, IQ tests correlate a lot with standardized tests and correlate with schoolwork, and it could be that the kids that are born later have less resources to spend specifically on them on stuff like tutors and after school programs and stuff that we know is going to improve people's grades and class performance. So this idea of, again, about IQ is oftentimes it's confabulated with so much other stuff. And it's frustrating to try to drill it down and get something useful out of it. And again, also, more schooling translates to a higher IQ. So if we want to say that intelligence is about like flexible, adaptive thinking, why does going to more school improve someone's intelligence? Because the way we measure IQ is basically through the same kinds of tests that we give kids. There is some fun stuff. So here, this is kind of another video relating to the fixed versus growth mindset idea. Let's boop over back to Chrome for a second, and whoop, there we go. I had to skip this one for a little bit because it starts with Philip Zimbardo. Wait, please don't start. Okay, thank God. I'm trying to keep it down to 0 mentions of Philip Zimbardo per lecture. At least 0 appearances. Sometimes I have to just mention that he sucks, and he does. But here we go. So this is about the power again of positive expectation. Because again, like we'll talk about it in a second.
Change a person's perception of a situation just as dramatically as negative expectations. Psychologists
Oh,
call
I had
this
to
the
listen to Philip
Pygmalion
Zimbardo.
effect, after the George Bernard Shaw play of the same name, in which even an uneducated ragamuffin can be transformed into a proper society lady. In an experiment conducted at an elementary school like this one, psychologists Robert Rosenthal and school principal Lenore Jacobson took the Pygmalion effect one step further.
What we wanted to show was the extent to which teachers' expectations could actually affect pupils' intellectual performance, for example, their IQ scores. So what we did was we tested everybody in a school with a test that pretended to be a test that would predict academic blooming, so-called Harvard test of inflected acquisition. And allegedly on the basis of that test, but not really, we gave each of the teachers in the school the names of a handful of children in her classroom that would get smart in the academic year ahead. These kids' names were taken out of a hat. We chose them by means of a table of random numbers. The children themselves did not know in any direct way that teachers were holding certain expectations for them. Teachers were told not to tell the kids, and of course we didn't tell the children either. So the children never knew.
6 times something that's close to 32. Good. 6 times 5.
And then when we tested the children a year later, we found that those kids who'd been alleged to their teachers to be showing or going to show intellectual gains, in fact showed greater intellectual gains than did the children of whom we'd said nothing in particular. So the kids actually got smarter when they were expected to get smarter by their teachers. We've come to feel that there are really 4 factors that operate in the mediation or communication of these self-fulfilling prophecies, especially.
We can cut that there. Yes, it is cruel and unusual. And yes, it's not. There's reasons we don't do studies like this when we can avoid it. But remember when we talked about those rats a while back, that some students were given rats. This is a great comparison. I already feel bad for making this. But way back when, you might remember that we talked about fixed versus growth mindset and this kind of stuff. It exists in rats as well. So some people, like students in this class, were given rats and they were told, these are very smart rats. They're going to learn the maze very quickly. Some were told that these are just average rats. They're just going to do kind of whatever. Well, it turns out that the students treated the rats that based on what their expectations were. So if they were told that the rat was going to learn quickly, they tended to be more attentive. They tended to give more attention to the rat, and the rats correspondingly tended to learn more quickly, even though there was no difference between them to begin with. There's a lot of power in expectation. And students that were when they told these teachers, hey, some of your students are gifted. They're gonna get much better, and they're gonna be very smart. Well, those students tended to do better at school and tended to be, because even if they didn't realize it, the teachers were treating them differently. And as someone who is an alumnus of a gifted education program, I think this is true. Being told you're one of the gifted kids does a lot for you to be motivated to try to fit that label and do all that stuff. And again, if that's actually showing real effects on IQ tests, well, then what is IQ really measuring? And as we've talked about before, things like exposure to lead and stuff can be factors that play into IQ. But what about stuff like access to tutors? Stuff like even basic nutrition. If you're a kid who's only eating 2 meals a day and your school isn't feeding you because they have a shitty program like lunch debt or something like that, those factors are going to play in here as well. IQ, especially in how it's applied in the educational system, is a slippery slope, and once students tend to fall behind, the system is set up that they just keep falling further behind. which is the exact opposite of what this was intended to be used for, which was to identify students that might need help and give them help. Ah! So fun facts here. This is just the miscellaneous stuff I'm going to throw at the wall toward the end. There is also a fun thing called the Flynn effect. It turns out that IQ has been going up on average about 3 points every 10 years. And this is true basically around the world. Britain, Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, Israel, it's basically the same trajectory. And it might be increased familiarity with tests. It could be about the complexity of the modern world. It could be about nutrition. It could be anything, but it's largely probably an environmental thing. It's not like there's a genetic influence that's causing people to get smarter over time in the aggregate. Yeah, but by and large, people are getting increasingly familiar with taking tests that were designed for children. That's an explanation for it. So other cool stuff, kind of in the same bits about IQ and all this, we've got sex differences in IQ. Most research shows that there is no overall variation. There might be there might be a little bit more variability among males and men, but there's no significant differences really in the aggregate between men and women in terms of IQ. And even the differences that are found on small specific mental tasks, like women being better on verbal tasks and men being better at spatial abilities, probably has more to do with the kinds of tasks that kids are given when it comes to their education and socialization. It probably has more to do with how we treat kids based on a gender binary and less to do with the way that kids really are. Yeah, personally, editorializing, it's bullshit. So here's a fun one. Not fun. We've already talked about this a little bit, so I'm going to be brief here. Some researchers have published that there are small racial differences in IQ measurement. Oh, yeah, answering the question, does lead have a negative effect on learning development? Yeah, lead exposure, especially chronic lead exposure, especially at young ages, has been linked to some developmental disabilities. But again, IQ tests could be used and were designed to identify issues like this to try to help people along and not to identify people to leave behind, which is like a big frustration I have with this literature. So generally, this is the bit. People that are not don't mysteriously have calipers in their office tend to dismiss out of hand the idea that there is a genetic difference in IQ between different groups. That is almost undoubtedly a result of biased testing. Remember, we talked about language. So yeah, if the testing is done in English and you learn English as a second language, of course, that is going to lead to discrepancies between groups because one group is trying to take a test in a language that they don't speak fluently. And what about societal biases and disadvantages? And it's like when environmental factors are held even with stuff like, and this is why I really am a big fan of stuff like, I brought up lunch debt before too, right? I think schools should just feed kids. Nutrition is a big factor. It is hard to learn when you are hungry. And we know that there are big socioeconomic differences in stuff like between a kid that's eating 3 meals a day and a kid that's eating 2. And so trying to even that playing field is just a good thing to do. Yeah. Schools should give free breakfasts and free lunches. After school programs should give snacks or free dinner. Because these kinds of societal biases and disadvantages have a real impact on kids. They're reflected in these standardized tests that are then used to determine the course for their course of their future and what doors are open and closed to them. Just it's so frustrating. Because really, it really comes down to, and one of my core issues with this whole field of literature is that it was conceived to identify the developmental trajectory of children and to try to identify people that might be lagging behind. But it has been extrapolated on and set forward to basically boost up the ego of wealthy white people. there, I don't have a teaching supervisor this semester. I can just say it. That it's basically, it's been used to justify an existing order instead of trying to talk about how there are things that we could do differently. We know from all this data what these biases are. We know how environment impacts IQ. We know that IQ is not a good measure. You just shouldn't do it. Like, it's garbage. And unless you're looking at a lot of these bits, like you're addressing stuff like biases and language processing, if you're not talking about societal biases and disadvantages, what's the point? And this is why organizations like Mensa piss me off. Because what is the point? All these IQ tests are shitty measures. They don't predict anything meaningful. What is the point in building your whole identity around it? Ah. Never mind. For people that are also, again, here's another fun thing. Stereotype threat. Turns out that people that have been stereotyped and expected to perform poorly are going to more often than not perform poorly because their performance becomes so much more evaluative. Let's say if you are, like, for example, I'm gay, I'm transgender, and it's like if I'm then being like, if I'm given a test on programming and told that I need to uphold the stereotype that trans people are good at programming, there's a whole dimension on that exam that is not there for other people. Or if you're from an ethnic group that is stereotyped as being good at math, but you are not personally good at math, it adds a whole nother dimension because you're supposed to be. You're expected to be good at math. And the inverse is true as well. Women that are looking to get into STEM are being asked to prove that they are good. They have to be so much better. Not only just to stand out and to prove that they're good, but to overcome stereotype threat. Because there's a whole nother dimension they have to face. And all this is true with IQ as well, because people have tried to extrapolate IQ into being the static, fixed thing that it is just not. And here's a dour note too. So creativity. Remember when we talked about thinking outside the box and divergent thinking? We would think about this as being a measure of intelligence, right? Or convergent thinking, trying to find the single best solution. Turns out that these two types of thinking, trying to think to generate solutions and then pick the best one, are barely correlated with IQ. Creativity, abstract thinking, I think these are things that everyone would say that is what, that should be a big part of intelligence. And it does not correlate with the way that we measure IQ. Being creative in problem solving, being able to find new solutions or pick between a set of options is not correlated with IQ. It's barely correlated, which means that the thing that we are measuring with IQ tests is not the way that most people think about intelligence at all, even a little bit. All right. Emotional IQ, again, there's been other attempts to revise IQ as an idea. Emotional intelligence is one of them. It's an ability to understand a person's emotions and apply them. But it's a personality metric more so than anything else. It's really a measure of extroversion and agreeableness. But this, again, much like IQ, EQ, or emotional intelligence or emotional quotient, is a hot topic for employee training seminars and executive seminars and screenings and all that. Even though, much like IQ, emotional intelligence is not a good predictor of job performance. It's not. But people just want to be able to think that there are certain people that are just like, they're empaths. They're very empathic. They have great emotional intelligence. They're going to make great executives. And it just doesn't match up to the reality of this at all. It's new. It is. It's absolutely new age Myers-Briggs. I'll talk about Myers-Briggs in one of these, and I'm gonna have as much vitriol as I do here. Oh. So when we talk about wisdom versus intelligence, wisdom gets floated around as an idea of applying intelligence toward a common good, being able to balance concerns for others and self-interest, and I don't know. It throws in there. It kind of comes up there. It feels like it's a more socially kind of a blend of intelligence and social and emotional intelligence and all that. But it is what it is. And I feel like wisdom and emotional intelligence are a sign that people really want to believe these things are real, and they really are very invested in them. And they're going to keep trying to work on them, even when it's very clear that the ship is sinking. And why do smart people, believe weird things? IQ is not a predictor of intelligence, or is not a predictor of scientific thinking. It's not correlated with a reduction in cognitive biases. And in fact, the people that have higher IQ because of the social weight that has been placed on it might find it easier to bolster their existing beliefs in the face of counterfactual information. I am smart. I am in Mensa. I have a high IQ. How could I be wrong that intelligence is stored in the brain balls? God, my head is in my hands. Then they have nothing to do with effort, right? The idea is you want it to believe, like, the people that get very invested in IQ want to believe that there is a magic number you can assign to people that is fixed throughout their life and is never going to change. They want a high score. They want a membership card, a high score, and they'll keep pulling up and keep doing bonk science to get it. And it sucks. And IQ is fake and not real, and that's chapter 9, and I need a drink.